What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Thursday, June 6th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. And we have a 7-game main slate tonight, which is going to be the focal point of the show. But there is also a 3-game slate starting in about an hour. So I'm not going to go game by game through the 3-game early slate. I don't generally think that's all that interesting on 3-game slates because the end conclusion is basically, yeah, you can play anybody for any reason. It's a 3-game slate. But I did already make my lineups for that slate, or at least I think I did. Maybe we'll get lineups between now and lock, in which case I might change things up a little bit. But I'll walk through my exposures on DraftKings and FanDuel so we can talk through those. I think that's probably a little bit more interesting than just saying play everybody. Obviously, my exposures aren't like the right answer. There's a lot of ways to approach these slates, but we can take a look at what I'm doing. And I actually haven't really looked at it yet, so it'll be a surprise to me too. And then we'll move on to game by game as usual for the 7-game night slate. No weather concerns today, so that should be pretty smooth, or at least no weather concerns right now. As always, give the video a thumbs up, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. All that stuff helps out quite a bit. Now, starting on DraftKings for the early slate, looking at the pitching that I'm getting to a lot of Yusei Kikuchi against Baltimore. I don't love it. It's obviously a really tough matchup against the O's. They are very difficult to strike out. They have a ton of good hitters. They're running a right-handed heavy lineup with a lot of power out there against Kikuchi. He has also been struggling a bit recently, which doesn't make me feel any better, but he is a good strikeout pitcher. He overall this season has not given up a lot of power. He's projected for about 50% ownership. I mean, it's a 3-game slate, so there's only so many ways you can go at pitcher. He has a 23.5% strikeout percentage and 3.34 xFIP overall. So I don't have a lot of confidence. I hate the matchup, all of that, but I am still getting to a lot of him. And then pretty similarly, getting to 58% Tanner Bybee. Not a great strikeout matchup against KC, but clearly one of the more talented pitchers on the slate. He has struck out 25.5% of hitters this year, 3.65 xFIP. So I'm pretty much right around the field on him. I'm a little bit below the field on Brian Wu. Good matchup against Oakland. Good price tag at 8,200. Good park to pitch in. I'm not too far below the field, but I'm getting to 30%. Have him projected around 49. Let me switch this over to my projection. Yeah, so have him projected around 49, 50%. So under the field, but still getting him a little bit. This is in 50 total lineups, by the way. JP Sears in 28% of my lineups. Fields at 41%, so a little bit low there as well. It seems like I'm basically just turning some of the field's Brian Wu and JP Sears into more Yusei Kikuchi, which, again, I don't love, but I don't hate it either. I wouldn't be upset if my exposures to Wu and Sears had been higher. I'm not really upset that I'm getting Kikuchi. Cade Povich and Brady Singer, neither one showing up too much for me. Doesn't surprise me too much. Povich does have good strikeout stuff. He, at AAA this year, has struck out about 32.5% of the hitters he's faced. Doesn't project to strike guys out at that rate in the majors. Also has a very difficult matchup in his debut against Toronto, a team that is just difficult to strike out on their own. And then Brady Singer, pretty expensive at 8,900, facing a Guardians team that's difficult to strike out. You could certainly make the case for either of these guys as contrarian plays if you wanted to, but I'm not really getting to them. Offensively, I am getting, it looks like, to a lot of Seattle, a lot of Cleveland. Dylan Moore, my highest owned hitter on DraftKings at 56%, 46% Jose Ramirez, 38% Bobby Witt. Obviously, perfectly fine with Witt. Does give you a ton of stolen base upside. Has the difficult matchup with Bybee, but negatively correlates with him. And it's not even like he has to do a lot of damage against him to have a good game himself. So getting there and then getting back to Seattle with Cal Raleigh, Julio Rodriguez, Jimenez, Manzardo showing up from Cleveland. From a stacking standpoint, I'm getting to Seattle a lot. So again, that is negatively correlating with a 40 or so percent owned JP Sears that does give up power. Cleveland not getting negative correlation with Brady Singer, and Singer has been improved this year, but you just have some good players at weak positions for Cleveland. KC is my third highest owned stack overall, and in 5-mans, 4-mans as well. And that's just, if I'm not playing Tanner Bybee, why not be playing KC? Probably won't get a ton of ownership. If we look at leverage on hitters here, you can see I'm well over the field on Bobby Witt, who's projected for 16%. I'm well over the field on MJ Melendez, Hunter Renfroe. So getting the KC as a contrarian stack, which I'm perfectly fine with. I'm well over the field on Jose Ramirez. Callum Manzardo is not projected for a lot of ownership. So getting to both of those teams as contrarian stacks. On FanDuel, a little bit different because you only have 5 pitchers here. Not that I played a lot of Povich on DraftKings, but you don't have the option on FanDuel. So I only have I have 4 pitchers on FanDuel. Getting to a lot of Kikuchi again. Same thoughts, obviously, as DraftKings, except for he is only 8K on FanDuel. So on DraftKings, he was more expensive relatively. On FanDuel, you are at least getting some value there, where he's less expensive than Bybee. He's less expensive than Singer and Wu. That wasn't the case on DraftKings. So a little bit easier to justify Kikuchi, but same sort of thing for me where I don't love that I'm getting there, but I don't hate it. Just kind of hoping for variance to work out in my favor. Bybee is projected for similar ownership to Kikuchi. It looks like I took some of that Bybee ownership and just moved it to Kikuchi. I am over the field here on Brady Singer. He's only projected for 4% ownership, which just seems a little bit low. So I got the 14% of him, and then I'm below the field on Wu. So basically, you have an $8,900 Singer in a much more difficult strikeout matchup than $9,100 Brian Wu. But I basically flipped their ownership and am playing more Singer. It's a worse spot, but it's baseball. There's a lot of variance. Sam Berg said, so doesn't Baltimore crush lefties, though? I'm scared. Yeah, they do. The matchup sucks. But there's a lot of variance in baseball. There's a lot of ways the slate can break down. You're generally not, especially on shorter slates, you're generally not going to be able to just go in and say, oh, well, this is a good matchup, so I'm going to play this and that, because that's what most of the field's going to do. And raw ownership just ends up taking on a bigger role on these slates. You also do have on these shorter slates a bit more negative correlation working with your pitchers as well. I didn't specifically look, but I can take a look now. Like if Baltimore is projected for more ownership than KC, it actually makes Kikuchi a little bit more interesting than Bybee amongst those top end pitchers, because if Kikuchi pitches well, you have Baltimore stacks not doing well. And then that obviously helps him as well. So like here you have Santander getting 28% ownership on FanDuel, Westberg getting 25%, Gunnar and Hayes relatively expensive. If you compare that to Kansas City, you get 22% to Bobby Witt, but then like 10% or less to all the other KC bats. So that's probably what is actually driving Kikuchi up for me. And I think that does make sense. I'm looking to see if that would be the case on DraftKings as well. I would like it. Yeah. So we see 31% coming into Hayes, 13% to Gunnar, a lot to Santander, a lot to Mountcastle, good amount to Westberg. If you compare that to Kansas City, once again, just not a lot of ownership coming into the KC guys. So I do think that's actually what the difference is. I hadn't really been able to figure it out. I didn't know why I was getting so much more Kikuchi than Bybee, since like if you're just talking matchups and everything, I would rather have Bybee. But I think that's what it is like they're both going to be popular, but if you play a lot of Bybee and he does well, great. But you're still competing not only with a huge you're competing with a huge percentage of the field that played Bybee, and you're not really knocking off too much of anything else. Whereas if you play Kikuchi at similar ownership and he does well, great. And you are still competing with a lot of teams that have him, but you do knock off like 25-30% of the field that was stacking Baltimore against him. So you get that negative correlation, which makes it a little bit more powerful in large field tournaments. Offensively on FanDuel, going to get to a lot of KC against Bybee, it looks like. Not surprising to me, given that he's getting a lot of ownership. I'm not really getting there, or I'm not getting as much ownership as the field, so why not be getting the KC bats against him? Bobby Witt, obviously one of the best plays on the slate, and I'm getting a ton. Also getting to Pasquantino quite a bit, which looks perfectly fine to me at 2,900. Pasquantino has a lot of power. Garcia leading off, I'm getting the 30%. He's projected for 10. So I'm getting to this top of the order and middle of the order KC guys quite a bit. Same reasons basically that I was just saying for why Kikuchi makes sense, even though the matchup sucks on a short slate. It's the same thing here. The matchup sucks for KC, no doubt about it. But if you look at the implied run totals up here, most of these teams are pretty similar. And KC does have stolen base upside in their lineup. They do have some power, especially at the top and in the middle of the order. And then mostly it's just Bybee over the course of a season, even though he's good, is just going to have a handful of games where he doesn't have it and he sucks. You're hoping on a 3-game slate that today's one of those days, and it just creates a very easy path to the top of tournaments where if it works out in your favor, 35-40% of the field just lost their pitcher, and you're not competing with as many teams as you would be if you just go to the offenses that project well, that everybody else is playing against low-owned pitchers. You're just creating an easier path this way going to those KC teams. After KC, getting to Seattle, just like I was on DraftKings, getting to Cleveland quite a bit against Singer, getting to Oakland, and then not getting much Toronto or Baltimore, which again, doesn't make me feel good. Like, I think those are probably the two best offenses to get to when you consider that Rogers Center is a solid park for home runs. You have Povich making his major league debut, so who the hell knows how that's going to go. You have Kikuchi facing a lineup that can do a lot of damage, but I think everything I just said is very obvious to everybody. So I would expect that you're just getting, a lot of ownership coming into these teams. Basically 18+% ownership to most of, to everybody in the Toronto lineup. Baltimore, we just looked at a minute ago, but not the entire lineup, but most of the lineup getting a lot of ownership there as well. So I'm not getting to them as much on FanDuel, even though from a chances of success standpoint, they look good. They just don't look as good when you factor in all the aspects of playing tournaments for me. So I'm getting the KC a lot there, and we'll see how that works out. Now, moving on to the main slate. Before we get there, as a reminder, if you are interested in using my MLB DFS projections, optimal percentages, top stacks, all of that stuff, you can sign up using the link in the description below. Regularly $25 a month. The link gets you 20% off. My goal with all of that is just to help you play at a higher level at a cost that is reasonable. Obviously, using sim tools is great. I use them. A lot of top players do. But it's also cost prohibitive if you're not playing a ton of money on any given slate. It can make it really, really difficult for you to profit when you're laying out money for Sims tools and everything else. So my goal was to basically give you the end results of a lot of the stuff that I do, tell you how often I think a player is going to be optimal. You can compare that to their ownership projections. You can use the data in that way. So you can still basically approximate the results that you're getting from Sims without having to pay for the full product. Obviously, you're not getting the full benefits either. But if you're hand building, if you're playing limited lineups, it's a way for you to improve the lineups you're building using data that goes beyond just median projections and all of that stuff. So you can make more informed decisions. Now, moving on to the main slate, did create lineups for this one before the show. We have the Dodgers taking on the Pirates in the first game. I obviously haven't, built out actual lineups for the slate yet. So now we're just back to normal, but Walker Buehler, 8,700, pretty good spot for him. Park upgrade going into PNC. The strikeout numbers for him haven't been great this year, but they're fine. 23% strikeout percentage through a handful of starts, 3.71 xFIP, and does get a pretty nice matchup in a good park. Pittsburgh is not a great offense. Having trouble loading the page that I'm trying to load. But if I remember correctly, a top 10 strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. Hopefully this refreshes at some point and I can confirm that. But about 14% ownership projected to Buehler. He showed up as optimal about 12% of the time for me. So I'm pretty much on board with that. Bailey Falter not getting any ownership. I don't really think that he should. He's not a good strikeout pitcher. He has a really, really, really tough matchup against the Dodgers. So I think we can move on from that one. The Dodgers, as usual, if you can get to them, great. I'm pretty much around the field on most of these guys. Shohei Ohtani, Will Smith, Mookie Betts, all really good options if you can get to them. I'm not getting to as much Betts as the field. I am around the field on Shohei and on Smith. I think the reason I'm not getting to Betts is probably just that there are other good shortstop options, although he does look a little bit better on this slate than usual because Bobby Witt Jr. is on that early slate. Gunnar Henderson is on that early slate. So you don't have quite as much competition at the top. You do still have Elly De La Cruz. You do still have, plenty of other shortstops, CJ Abrams, Anthony Volpe. It's a relatively deep position, but you are missing Henderson and Witt as direct competition to Mookie. Bailey Falter doesn't miss a lot of bats. He does generally do a good job of getting just weak contact, but righties have done damage. 215 expected ISO against him this year. So he just basically has a very small margin for error. We've seen several starts from him where he's very pitch efficient. He works deep in the games, just gets routine flyouts and all of that. But if he's not locating perfectly, he doesn't have the stuff to overcome that. And so over the course of the season, you're going to see power numbers against him. And really, that's just what you're hoping for if you're going to the Dodgers here. If you're watching the game, it certainly has the potential to really frustrate you because you're watching somebody that it feels like you probably could have hit when you were in high school, but he just is locating and getting, weak contact. But again, small margin for error. If he's off, he's likely to get lit up. And you have extremely good hitters here in this Dodgers lineup. On the other side for Pittsburgh, not a ton of interest, but they are pretty inexpensive. O'Neal Cruz at 4,300, pulling about 10% ownership. No real issues with that. He hasn't been great offensively this year, but he does give you power and stolen base upside, although it is a tough matchup against Buehler. Brian Reynolds is good. Grandal's 3,100 at catcher. There is some value for Pittsburgh, and it is only a 7-game slate, but the Dodgers clearly look like the preferred side here for me. Atlanta taking on the Nats in Washington. They had a really bad game yesterday against Nick Pivetta, who struck out about 1 million guys in Fenway. Today they face Mitchell Parker, who so far has been impressive in his rookie season. He projects as a decent major league pitcher. He's mostly outperformed those projections this year. The strikeout percentage has come down a little bit. He's at 21.3% now, 3.46 xFIP, 3.44 FIP. Hasn't allowed a lot of power, less than 1 home run per 9 innings. So he has been solid, but it is a tough matchup for him against the Braves. I think he's going under-owned at 7,200. You can see I have him being optimal about 12% of the time. He's getting about 4% ownership. Still not somebody that I expect to prioritize, just probably a little bit underpriced and under-owned here. Somebody I think you can use as a contrarian play if you need it, but certainly not somebody that I have a ton of confidence in, given the fact that this Atlanta lineup does still have a lot of good hitters, even without Ronald Acuna being healthy. On the other side, Reynaldo Lopez, $9,100 price tag. Not the best strikeout matchup against Washington, but not a terrible one. They rank 19th in K percentage against right-handed pitching, 21.5%. They do only have a 90 WRC plus on their active roster, though. Lopez has been solid as a starter this year, 24% K percentage, 3.71 xFIP, getting about 10% ownership, and that's around where he showed up for me also. Just looks like a perfectly solid option at 9,100. Offensively, Atlanta showing up as my second most utilized total stack, my third most utilized 5-man stack. It's, again, a pitcher in Parker that has outperformed expectations a bit so far this year. He hasn't given up a lot of power so far, but you just have so much power in the Atlanta offense, even though they've been struggling lately. Still going to go to him in a spot like this. 168 expected ISO allowed to righties so far for Parker. You did also have a game yesterday where the Nats had to get into their bullpen a bit. The Mets scored 9 runs, so that potentially works in the Braves' favor as well. Albies at 5,100, Riley only 4,900. This is another big component of why Atlanta looks so good. You're not you can bring up that they've struggled recently and the lineup isn't as good without Acuna, and all of that is absolutely true. But it becomes not as important when you say, oh, well, they've been hitting poorly lately, I don't want to play them. And you can point out that they're discounted 10 to 20% in salary because of how they've been hitting lately. You combine that with the fact that these guys are just by the end of the season going to have had good years. And I'm more than happy to pay 5,100 for Albies or 4,900 for Riley. Olson's pretty cheap. Darno's cheap. Ozuna's the only expensive guy in this lineup, really. And he's been hitting well for most of the season. So the salaries combined with just the underlying talent level for this team still make them look pretty good. CJ Abrams individually at shortstop gives you stolen base upside, which is really nice. Has some power as well. Don't mind getting to him individually. I think he's actually going a little bit under-owned here. Showed up as optimal for me about 10% of the time. Only projected for about 6% ownership, so I like that. Keibert Ruiz looks like a good value. Other than that, I don't anticipate getting to too much Washington. I think they're going a little bit under-owned against Lopez, but Abrams and Ruiz are the only ones that really stick out to me. Minnesota's taking on the Yankees in Yankee Stadium, so nice park upgrade for the Twins from a home run standpoint. Pablo Lopez going for Minnesota at $8,500 on DraftKings. Marcus Stroman going for the Yankees at $8,400. Lopez is a really good pitcher. He has the second highest strikeout percentage on the slate at 27%. 23.1% K-minus BB percentage is also second best. Both of those numbers trail only Sonny Gray for St. Louis. 3.1 xFIP also, not second best, but still very good. Very, very difficult matchup. So the salary has dropped a little bit on Lopez, which is nice. The Yankees are a difficult team to strike out. They obviously have a lot of power in their lineup. They are in a park that plays up power. So it's very difficult to have confidence in Lopez here, but it is a 7-game slate. There's not a ton of great pitching. He's projected for 23% ownership. I think that's a little bit high, but he still showed up 18% optimal for me. So at that price, still willing to get to Lopez and just hope that his talent wins out against a very, very dangerous Yankees lineup. On the other side, Marcus Stroman, basically the same price, getting 8% ownership, showed up as optimal 10% for me. Not a good strikeout pitcher, only striking out 19.3% of hitters this year. He is also walking too many guys this year with a 10.2% walk percentage. 9.1 K minus BB percentage is one of the weaker marks on the slate. 4.24 xFIP. I think that on a larger slate, he probably just wouldn't really be getting mentioned at all. But with it being a 7-gamer, showing up around 10% of the time, perfectly fine. Basically an average matchup against Minnesota. They've struck out 22% of the time against right-handed pitching this year. They have a league average 100 WRC plus. So he's kind of just a guy that if he falls into lineups here and there, that's fine. But he's not somebody that I would expect to be targeting if I'm playing, a handful of lineups or anything like that. Lefties have done damage against him this year as well. 206 expected ISO, 250 actual ISO allowed. And we know that Yankee Stadium does really play up left-handed power. Minnesota is showing up as a middle-of-the-road stack for me. But I think individually, this is probably a team that you can find some value. Alex Kirilloff, 3,600 with multi-position eligibility, projected for 4% ownership, showed up as optimal 8% of the time for me. Basically the same thing for Kepler at 4,400. Trevor Larnach, $3,900 price tag, 5% optimal for me, 5% ownership for the field. So I think that these left-handed bats are pretty interesting. And then you have Ryan Jeffers, if he's in the lineup, who just has power from the right side. You did get Royce Lewis back. He is expensive. He's the only guy on this team that is expensive. I'm not sure if he's in the projected lineup that I used or not, but one way or the other, he does add talent to this lineup as well if he is in it. But the lefties here are the ones that I think stand out against Stroman. On the other side for the Yankees, if you go to them, you're really just banking on their talent, similarly to how you're just banking on Pablo Lopez's talent if you go to him against the Yankees. Very good pitcher, very good offense. They're not projected for much ownership here, which I think does make them interesting, especially when you factor in that Lopez is getting ownership. This, to me, seems more like a spot where you should be playing both sides if you're playing a lot of lineups because of how much talent there is. If the field is just going to say, well, we're going to play Pablo Lopez and we're going to ignore the Yankees, that makes the Yankees really interesting, since if they do well, 20 to 25% of the field is just losing one of their pitchers. It goes without saying that Juan Soto and Aaron Judge at low ownership are good plays. There is a good chance that ownership number comes up by lock, just because everybody wants to play these guys. So I think there is a tendency to kind of underproject their ownership, especially early in the day when maybe you haven't projected some of the hitter value that's going to end up being there. That makes it easy to get to them. So probably I think comes up a little bit, but either way, probably will be relatively low owned because of the matchup, and they are good plays. Like if you're getting, I prefer the Shohei Ohtani, Mookie Betts pay-ups against Falter, but they're getting, 2 to 3x the ownership right now. And anytime somebody is 2 to 3x more popular than Juan Soto or Aaron Judge, you can obviously make a good argument to just go to the lower owned Soto or Judge. DJ LeMahieu is cheap if you need value here. So is Austin Wells, Torres, Volpe. These guys look okay if you're stacking. But obviously a relatively low probability stack because of Lopez, but still a very, very high upside offense. Cubs are taking on the Reds in Cincinnati. So the best hitters park on the slate for this game. For the Cubs, Javier Assad at 7,800. For the Reds, Hunter Green at $8,200. So Hunter Green, very good strikeout pitcher, 25.9% K percentage this year. Does walk too many guys with a 10.2% walk percentage, 4.23 xFIP. Gives up power in addition to walking guys. So really creates a boomer bust spot in this stadium that does play up offenses. He hasn't given up as many home runs this year, but generally in his career, he has been somebody that gives up some power. Sub 100 expected ISO to lefties and a 118 expected ISO to righties so far this year. Last year, 182 expected ISO to righties. So maybe has made some improvements. He is young. It is likely that he's going to get better going forward. One way or the other, it's not a great matchup for the Cubs, but it is a great park to hit in. Hunter Green projected for 33% ownership, showed up about 19% of the lineups that I built. So looks like one of the more likely to succeed pitchers on the slate, but also looks like one of the more over-owned pitchers. I'm interested to see how that ends up working out for me in the lineups I play, because being over-owned, especially when you're just talking about a pitcher and you have plenty of other roster spots to differentiate, being over-owned isn't the end-all be-all. It doesn't mean you just can't play the guy. It doesn't mean that I'm just not going to play him, but it does mean that there's probably a really nice set of lineups I can build that have pitchers other than Green and then are getting to the Cubs against him, leveraging against what I think is an overowned pitcher. I know that happened for me quite a bit yesterday. I can't remember who the pitcher was anymore, but there was a good pitcher that I thought was overowned that I ended up just stacking against a lot. I don't think it worked out well, but that's not the point. My point just being like, there is a decent chance I end up getting to the Cubs because of that. But Hunter Green still gives you a high ceiling here. Third highest strikeout percentage on the slate this season. Javier Assad, not a great strikeout pitcher, but he is a pretty decent pitcher overall. And his strikeout numbers are up this year. 23.2% strikeout percentage, 4.02 xFIP. Facing a Reds lineup that will strike out also. Second highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching at 26.8%. 95 WRC plus. Obviously, the park sucks for pitching. But I do think Assad's going a little bit overlooked here. Field's projected for 10 to 11% ownership. I have him being optimal 14 to 15%. So nothing too crazy, but I think he's going a little under-owned, probably in part just because his strikeout numbers have ticked up this year. That's something that maybe isn't being accounted for as much as I care about it. So I probably just have a little bit higher projection, but even if you look at my projection compared to like SaberSim, it's basically the same. So I just think Assad going a little bit under-owned here, given the strikeout matchup against the Reds. That being said, it is a park where getting to either offense is going to look good. Cubs are showing up as my fourth most utilized stack. Cincinnati, middle of the pack as well. Chicago, my second highest 5-man stack. Reds are sixth. And it really just goes to the upside that comes with this park. Like neither matchup against the starting pitcher is ideal, but there is still the potential for both of them to struggle. Obviously, that's the case for any pitcher, and neither of them are, elite pitchers yet. Green probably will be at some point, but I wouldn't put him in that category yet. And then you also still get, the potential of a bullpen blowing up, even though it's obviously very difficult to hit against bullpens in 2024 baseball. You still see, just the bad bullpen game, or, a game gets out of hand and then you're getting the worst relievers, whatever it may be. There's just a ton of upside because of this park, how good it is for scoring runs, and also specifically how good it is for hitting home runs. So I think this is just a game where I'm probably going to end up getting a good amount of exposure, especially because the offenses aren't getting a lot. This seems like a spot where the field maybe just isn't going to get to the offenses as much because the pitching is good, when this really stands out as a good spot to hit, really good offensive park. You have, of the 7 games today, you have a game in St. Louis where it's very difficult to hit home runs. You have a game in San Diego where it's very difficult to hit home runs. Same goes for Pittsburgh. So, Washington is fine for home runs. Yankee Stadium, obviously really good. White Sox is fine. But, of the 7 games on the slate, you have 3 parks that really suck for hitting home runs, and you have 1 that is elite. So I'm interested, especially at these ownership numbers, in getting to bats from this game. I don't think that it's anything really specific. I don't think that I'm really looking at the matchups against these pitchers and saying like, oh, I want this hitter against that pitcher. It's more so just saying, if either of these pitchers don't have their best stuff, this park gives you the potential for just home run after home run. I mentioned Green's power numbers being limited so far this year already. Assad, 163 expected ISO to righties, 149 to lefties. So again, he's not somebody either that you're looking at and saying, oh, this hitter profiles really well against him. You're really just playing the park and the upside that comes with it. One more thing to mention before I move on to the next game. Already mentioned my MLB DFS package, but also in the process of launching a new site, not daily content based, not projections based, although I will have some of my stuff included there also, but more higher end overarching strategy based with some of the best players that have played DFS. Brick75, Uticow, Nerdy Tenor, and myself, putting out training videos, hanging out in Discord, doing Q&As, stuff like that, to help you get better from a strategy standpoint at DFS, doing more teaching than, just giving you projections and everything. That site hasn't launched yet, but it will be launching soon. If you want to get on the email list, use the link in the description below for Endgame Syndicate. Get your name on that email list. It's on the landing page that link will take you to. That should be launching shortly, and I'm really excited about that. I think I'll learn from it. I think you'll learn from it. It's the kind of content that I've always wanted to do, so looking forward to that, and check it out if you haven't already. Now, Colorado taking on the Cardinals in St. Louis. Getting out of Coors Field, so the Rockies immediately become less interesting than they have been in recent games. And you get Sonny Gray against them, who has been one of the best pitchers in baseball this year. Only 9,500 in this spot in St. Louis, projected for 42% ownership, showing up as optimal 35% of the time for me. I'm actually a little bit surprised that he's not showing up as optimal more for me, because I do generally have a higher projection on Sonny Gray than anyone else, or at least than, most of the other industry sources. You can see here, I'm a few points higher than SaberSim is. So I expect to be getting to a ton of Sonny Gray today, even though I do have him going a little bit over-owned. I just still have him being like such a good pitcher in this spot. You have a great matchup against Colorado, who has the 6th highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year, despite playing their home games in a park that is one of the most difficult places to strike out. They're still striking out a ton overall, and now they're going into St. Louis. They have an 85 WRC plus against right-handed pitching. And then you get to Gray, who so far this season has struck out 33.5% of hitters, 27% K minus BB percentage is the best on the slate by 4 points. The strikeout percentage is 6.5 points higher than Pablo Lopez, who was second best on the slate. 2.49 xFIP is better than anybody on the slate by like half a run. Just a really, really good pitcher in a really good spot. With the way things have gone recently, that probably means he's giving up like 6 runs, but that's obviously not going to deter me from rostering him tonight. So Sonny Gray looks really, really good. I expect he'll be my highest owned pitcher on the slate. Julian said Gray will get blown up because all good pitchers get slammed now. I fully expect you're going to get like a 4-run first inning or something for Colorado, but nothing I can really do about it. Cal Quantrill going for the Rockies. Not really interested in getting to him. 17.8% K percentage, 4.25 xFIP so far this season. Offensively, St. Louis showing up middle of the pack for me as far as stacks go. Quantrill's not a total gas can. He's just not a particularly great strikeout pitcher or pitcher overall either. I'm right around the field on Herrera. I'm a little below the field on Gorman, although I do think that's a good value at 3,900. Completely understand why he's getting the ownership that he is. Just a ton of power at second base. Somehow that price tag just keeps not adjusting. But from a range of outcome standpoint, I just don't have him being optimal as much as the field is playing him. But again, that's not always the end of the world because you're not actually trying to make the optimal lineup in MLB DFS. It's never going to happen. You're not going to do it. You're going to lose a ton of money trying to do it. So, you have to keep that in mind too when you see somebody going a little bit over-owned. Mason Wynn looks like a good value if he's at the top of the lineup at 3,400. Donovan, Goldschmidt, this lineup gives you a lot of value. So I do think you'll see some ownership coming in here. I'm just not getting to them as much. I think it's a spot where I'll probably just be looking elsewhere. Colorado going under-owned for me just because they're projected for like 1 to 2% ownership, and they're like 4 to 5%. A lot of these guys to be the top play. Given how much I like Gray, I doubt that I get to Colorado, but I could see it being a situation where like across 50 lineups, I have 75, 80% Gray, and the like 4 or 5 lineups that don't have Gray happen to be Colorado stacks. From a portfolio standpoint, that's not something I would mind at all. I also wouldn't mind if I'm just jamming Sonny Gray completely. But it's a low probability spot. They should be a little bit higher owned than they are. They may end up being a little bit higher owned than they are too. A lot of times you will see the ownership projection on these bottom teams doesn't quite get it right, and it does make a big difference. Like it's something to pay attention to if you're using sim tools also. If you're using like 1% projections for your field lineup in sims, it's going to tell you the Rockies are a better play than they are, because realistically they're probably going to be like 3% owned, 3.5, 4. And while that's still very low owned, it is much different than being 1% owned. So that's something to keep in mind as well, just in general, not even Rocky specific. Going to the next game in Chicago, Red Sox taking on the White Sox. Another one of the better pitchers on the slate in a good matchup. Tanner Houck, $9,800 price tag. So he is more than Sonny Gray, which is not correct, but he does deserve a very good salary, especially in this spot. On the other side, Jake Woodford at 5,800. Not a very good strikeout pitcher. Not somebody that I expect to be getting to tonight. I do expect to be getting to Houck. 26% projected ownership, 23.5% chance of being optimal for me. So you see him getting similar ownership to Pablo Lopez. I have him as a better play than Lopez, even factoring in the $9,800 salary. He struck out 24.1% of hitters this year, 4.8% walk percentage. Those numbers are good. 19.3 K minus BB percentage is better than everybody except for Sonny Gray and Pablo Lopez. 2.89 xFIP. Been very, very good at preventing runs. 2.15 FIP. He's allowing no power at all. 0.12 home runs allowed per 9 innings so far this season. If you look at his expected numbers, obviously they are worse than the no power at all that he's allowed, but still a 133 expected ISO allowed to righties, 109 to lefties, 29.5% K percentage to righties, only 20% to lefties. So his projection will change a little bit depending on exactly what lineup the White Sox run out there. The projected lineup I'm looking at has 6 righties in it. And if that's the case, that sets up really nicely for Houck. If they run some lefties out there, then the strikeout projection goes down a little bit, but you're also probably just getting worse hitters because the White Sox are not a team that can start 9. They can't start 9 good hitters. They certainly don't have them just sitting on their bench to platoon. So one way or the other, it's going to look like a good spot to get to Tanner Houck. The Red Sox are going to look like a good offense as well. One of the higher implied run totals on the slate. They're showing up 3rd most often in all stack types for me, 4th most in 5-mans. Perfectly fine park to hit in. Woodford hasn't been in the majors a lot recently. He came up with the Cardinals years ago. So tough to get a real sample on him. Going back to last year, he's thrown 534 pitches to righties, 461 to lefties. Lefties had a 240 expected ISO with only a 12.5% K percentage. Righties had a 212 expected ISO with a 14.5% K percentage. If you go back to 2022, the numbers get a little bit better. But point being, this is one of the weaker guys on the slate. How bad he is kind of tough to determine, but it's pretty safe to say he's one of the worst pitchers. And then on top of that, you're getting cheap pricing with the Red Sox as well. So they are going to be popular. You are going to need to pay attention to what the rest of your lineup looks like around these Red Sox stacks. But Valdez, especially if he's sitting second again at 3,100, doesn't give you a ton of power upside, but just hitting second on a team with one of the highest implied run totals on the slate is going to make him project well. Rafael Devers is obviously just a really high upside play all of the time. Dominic Smith is really cheap. Connor Wong gives you some upside at catcher. Jarren Duran gives you stolen base upside in addition to being able to hit. Tyler O'Neill's got a ton of power. So the Red Sox stack just very, very easy to get to. And again, as a result, they are going to be popular, probably a little bit overowned from a range of outcomes / optimal standpoint, but still a stack that I like getting to. You just have to figure out ways to be contrarian around it. Often, a lot of times I'll use mini stacks in this case as well. So I get a low owned team as my primary stack, and then I just have like a couple of Red Sox, hope that they do really well, and the rest of the team mostly disappoints. Like yesterday is a good example of that. The Red Sox as a 5-man stack were perfectly fine, but you were better off really if you just had like Rafael Devers plus Jarren Duran plus 5 guys from any of the other teams on that slate, really, like the Mets, the Giants, the Reds. So a lot of times that's the approach I end up taking with these like really popular value stacks that are also just clearly in a good spot, as opposed to either just jamming a 20% owned stack or saying, well, I'm not going to play one of the best spots on the slate. That's another way that you can be different. You can also be different within, like if you're 5-man stacking Boston, if you 5-man stack them without Valdez, you're already different because he's projected for 24% ownership. If you 5-man stack them without Devers, you're different because obviously people like Devers is projected for 11% ownership overall, but his ownership within Boston stacks is going to be extremely high because who wants to stack Boston without Devers? I'm not saying like that's a huge key to the slate is stacking this team without their best hitter, but it is a way to get a 5-man Boston stack and still be relatively different. So there are ways to do that as well. Generally, I like going the mini stack route. For the White Sox, I think basically rinse and repeat everything I said about the Rockies. They suck. Their matchup sucks. They are facing a popular pitcher. They will be low owned. If you want to go there and just hope to run really good, fine. Probably, hopefully, not what I'm going to be doing. And then finally, the last game on the slate, going back to another pitcher-friendly park with the Diamondbacks facing the Padres in Petco. Randy Vasquez on the mound for San Diego. Slade Ciccone is going for the Diamondbacks. Brutal matchup for Ciccone. The Padres do not strike out. They have the lowest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year at 16.8%. They also have a 125 WRC plus to go along with it. Really tough to want to get to Ciccone. Randy Vasquez at 5,600 is getting some ownership, 15% projected ownership, 15% chance of being optimal. It's a price play. He's 5,600. The matchup against the Diamondbacks isn't great. They have underperformed overall this year offensively. They have a 96 WRC plus, but that number is likely to come up just based on the talent in their lineup. 22% K percentage against right-handed pitching, ranks 17th. It's really just the park and the salary for Vasquez. And the fact that you don't have a ton of good pitching in good matchups on this slate. Like you have Houck, you have Gray, 2 guys that like I would just love to get as much as I can, but they are relatively expensive. Lopez is in a tough matchup. Green's in a tough matchup in park. Buehler is in a pretty decent matchup, but you do have a pretty high actually run total for the Pirates, given who they are in the park they're playing in. So that's a little bit scary. And Buehler is not exactly cheap either. So paying down at SP2 is just going to make sense in some roster builds, especially like he's going to allow you to get to the Dodger stacks, for example. So it's not a matter of Randy Vasquez being any good. Limited sample this year, but only striking out 15% of hitters. It's not even that the matchup with the Diamondbacks is great. It's really just saying he's 5,600. He should be 6,600 or 6,700. So you're getting value there, and then you can get really high upside hitters around him. Doesn't really have anything to do with him. Offensively, not a great park for hitting home runs. I do think that getting to the Diamondbacks in tournaments makes some sense given the ownership coming into Vasquez. We've talked about maybe getting to stacks against like Hunter Green or Sonny Gray or Tanner Houck. I would very obviously rather be stacking against Randy Vasquez, even though the park isn't great. You do still get that negative correlation. You also get a cheap offense with Arizona. Corbin Carroll, 4,400 with stolen base upside, even if he's forgotten how to hit. Ketel Marte, Christian Walker both have power. Peterson's reasonably priced. Most of this lineup is just pretty cheap because as a whole, they have underperformed this year, like I said. And by the end of the year, they're probably just going to be more expensive. So I do think Arizona is an interesting negative correlation / low-owned contrarian stack. San Diego is a really good offense, as I mentioned. They're not getting much ownership either. I hate going to this park, but on a 7-game slate, it is a little bit easier. And on this slate specifically, too, because sort of like I was mentioning before, you have Pittsburgh, you have St. Louis. Neither of those parks are great for offense. Washington, Yankee Stadium, Cincinnati, to some extent, Chicago are fine. It's different going to Petco when you're talking about like a 12-game slate that has Coors Field and Dodger Stadium and Great American and every good hitters park. It's a little bit easier when it's only a 7-game slate and there's only a few hitters parks on the slate. You're getting a lot of talent here in a fine matchup at low ownership, so that does seem interesting to me. Going back to last season, Cicconi's only struck out 12.8% of lefties with a 217 expected ISO allowed. Righties have struck out at a higher mark at 22.8%, but they also have a 219 expected ISO allowed. This season, both sides of the plate also have expected ISOs north of 200, and Arizona's bullpen has had to work. Their long guy yesterday threw 75 pitches in relief of Jordan Montgomery. They had another one of their primary relievers, Bryce Jarvis, pitched 3 days in a row. If I remember correctly, I know at least back-to-back days, so probably not going to be available today. This is a spot where if the Padres get to Ciccone early, the Diamondbacks might kind of just throw in the towel and not have a lot to throw at the Padres here as far as effective relievers go. So there is some added upside as well outside of a pretty solid matchup against Ciccone. Cronenworth individually stands out to me. 4,300 at second base, and then obviously getting to Tatis, Machado, if he's in the lineup, looks good. But I do think the bullpen angle here, in addition to just a decent matchup against Ciccone, makes the Padres pretty interesting and probably a little bit underprojected just because I'm pretty sure that is not something that's factored in the projections. So that's the 7 games on this slate. Pitching wise, Sonny Gray, Tanner Houck stand out as my top 2. Gray, number 1 by a pretty wide margin for me, followed by Houck. Then I think you get Hunter Green, Pablo Lopez, Randy Vasquez, Javier Assad, Walker Buehler, pretty much all kind of just lumped together, factoring everything in as far as their chances of success. Favorite low-owned, completely, low-owned contrarian play at pitcher is Mitchell Parker. Again, that doesn't come with a lot of confidence. It's a tough matchup. He's probably not as good as he has been so far this year going forward, but he is a guy where I think he's basically Eric Fetty from last night's slate, where I ended up playing, I think, like 12%. And he just works as somebody if, like, let's say you're playing the Red Sox, you're going with like a chalk 5-man Red Sox stack. You have a couple other good hitters in there that are relatively popular, and you just want to throw in Mitchell Parker. Works perfectly fine in a lineup like that. Home run call, I will go with. I'm going to go to Kepler in Yankee Stadium. I think that looks like a pretty good spot. And top stacks, Dodgers, if you can afford them, obviously look good. I mentioned Parker as a contrarian play. I do like the Braves at their prices as well. Red Sox look like a good stack, although the ownership is concerning. I like the Padres as a sneaky stack. They are not getting much ownership. They're not showing up a ton in the lineups I built, but that goes back to the point I was making of projections are not going to factor in all of the added upside that they have after they get Ciccone out of the game because of the state of Arizona's bullpen. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you again for checking out the show. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, notifications, all of that. And I will see you back here at the normal time tomorrow for Friday's slate. Thanks again.